case that matters for folks. Hope that's okay.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Adam and Eric. So I'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining me this morning, and thank you for inviting me to talk about culture responsiveness and considerations for minoritized youth, which I use pretty broadly, but I'll describe what I'm referring to as I go through. I want to start by talking about the current context of education. When we think about the historical context of education, a lot of our norms have been predicated on white middle class expectations, where historically white students and teachers have benefited from structural advantages and minoritized youth have underperformed in academics and have higher rates of high school dropout and higher rates of discipline. Why are some of these things at play? One, when you think about white, like I said, as the default dominant culture, we have to think about implicit and explicit bias, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but something that we all have to contend with, and that we all have, and how the norms for student behaviors and success affect students differentially. If you think about, again, historically, the way that schools have been set out have been set up shuts out opportunities for new cultural norms that are representative of student diversity to be incorporated or accepted. We also have an overwhelmingly white workforce for teachers, and I think 82% of our public school teachers are white, and 90% of administrators are. For the first time, though, in 2014, there was a majority minoritized population in public schools. And since then, the numbers have wavered between about 52 to 54% of students representing minoritized backgrounds. And I want to be clear that right now I'm talking specifically about race and ethnicity, but we'll talk about culture more broadly as we progress through this PowerPoint. But again, just laying some of the current context of education. And so what happens sometimes is, there are these kind of hidden rules or cultural mismatch where there are these school expectations about what does it mean to engage in parental involvement? What does it mean to be a good student? What does it mean to follow rules related to like discipline? And then there's the home culture, where students sometimes feel like there's a clash between their home culture and their school culture. Maybe you've heard the term before, like code switching, and feeling like when you're at school, you feel sort of out of place because the norms there don't match what the norms are at home. And so these hidden rules affect behavioral expectations and communication styles. And sometimes there's a conflict when we think about that. And so as a teacher, if I have expectations about what parental involvement looks like, and I have some parents that aren't involved, then that might change my perceptions in working with the student. And I think that that's something that we have to really think about. And I didn't give too much history about myself, but when I first finished school, I taught special education in Atlanta, Georgia for 3 years. And the schools that I was at, one was predominantly white, one was predominantly Latinx. And even across those two schools, parental involvement looked very differently. And so very different. And so I had to kind of be able to adjust to figure out what is the best way to engage with parents, and how does that change depending on the context? How does that change depending on student age? And how does that change depending on the cultural norms? So that's part of it. What has this resulted in? We talk often about the achievement gap. I challenge us, though, instead to think about this as an opportunity gap, because achievement gap presumes that even if minoritized students or students living in poverty have access to rigorous instruction and nurturing educational environments, that these gaps will still exist. And so when we think about achievement gap, it's this kind of labeling of certain students that they won't be able to be successful, even if they were provided with the same resources as their counterparts. Instead, when I say opportunity gap, we are dispelling this myth of this inferiority complex or this less than or this need to be fixed. And instead, we question ourselves about how can we as educators facilitate an environment that creates access to quality schools and resources for minoritized students and students living in poverty. And so not so much as an achievement gap, but an opportunity gap. Have our students had the opportunity to access advanced coursework? Have they had the opportunity to access experiential learning opportunities? Have they had the opportunity to access rigorous instruction and rigorous teaching? And those really are two different things. And not only are they two different things conceptually, but they also have an impact on how we perceive our students and the expectations that are tied to students. And if I often think about it in terms of like unequal inputs, in terms of opportunity, will lead to unequal outputs, which is achievement. And that's what we have seen over and over within the context of education. We see schools that where there's a majority minoritized population, there are less resources, there are less opportunities to engage in advanced coursework, there are higher rates of discipline, and there are higher rates of high school graduation. And these aren't because of these innate inferiorities that students have. It relates to kind of what I said earlier, in part what I said earlier about the current context of education and how we've started to shift over time, as I think many of you probably in your schools have seen a shift in your school population. And so we've definitely come a long way, but obviously still have some more work to do. The other concepts I want to talk about are equality versus equity. We talk about both of those oftentimes, but I don't know how much we actually think about that on the day to day. We think about equality as like, I'm giving all students the same. I treat everyone the same. I don't see any students differently. Like it's this one size fits all approach. The problem with equality is that you can't actually get to equality unless you first address equity. And that is providing all students with the supports and resources they need to be successful. Probably the best way to describe that is when we think about students with disabilities, in order to make sure that they have equal access to being successful, we first make sure that there's equity. So whether that means additional time on work, whether that means that they get pulled out, whether that means that they have these various accommodations to be able to allow them to access the academic content. And so that's one of the ways, probably most obvious ways that we talk about equality and equity. But the same things happen when we have just different school populations and how we have to think about that. For example, what the research has shown over the years is that students who come from poverty or low socioeconomic status backgrounds start school with somewhere between 250 and 500 fewer words than their counterparts. So how do we then, knowing that about our students, how do we then create an environment that offers them opportunities to be able to increase their vocabulary? Part of that is maybe asking open-ended questions. So instead of saying, do you understand this? And students saying yes. Instead of saying, how was your day? And they say good. Instead of asking those closed-ended questions, asking open-ended questions, because it makes students engage in conversation and thereby increase their vocabulary. How do we do class labeling, or when we're going to start new text, how do we kind of preface it with these are the vocabulary terms to be aware of? And as we go through different grades and upper grades, this is still something. Oh, I heard something. Sorry. This is still something that is important, and that we all have to think about in terms of being able to support students. So I challenge us to not think about this one size fits all approach, but to think about how do we make sure that our students have what they need in order to be able to have the opportunity to be successful. One of the ways that we illustrate this also is, we say for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. We do this over and over in education. We first say there's differentiated instruction and we need to make sure that students have what they need. And then at the end of the year, everyone has to take the same standardized exam. But when we look at these different participants, then you recognize that there's always going to be sort of this difference in how students achieve. And so if this were math and it was climbing a tree, then we would expect for the monkey to really excel. If this were switched to, who can stay in the water for the longest, then we might look at we might look at the fish or the penguin or not the penguin, the fish, and they might be more successful. So here, if everybody is a genius, right, in their own right, but if we judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life thinking that it's stupid. And I say that to illustrate that we have to switch from thinking about these deficits that students have and think about what can we do to bolster their skills and increase their capacity to be able to be successful in an educational environment. And this picture illustrates it really well because, like I said, at different times, students, do well at different things, and it's something that we have to continuously be thinking about when supporting our students. So I always think about this as standardize the process, but customize the implementation, which I think is an important way to think about it. That right there are core features, core tenets of teaching, of your curriculum, of your expectations that are in place, but there's some customization in the ways that those play out in school, the ways that you support students in learning, the ways that you support students in following or carrying out rewards and acknowledging positive and or negative behaviors. And so we should have these core tenets, these core kind of values, but be flexible in the way that we implement them.
Tamika, can I interrupt really quick? I'm not sure if you are intending to be sharing slides.
You don't see them?
No, we don't see the slides. At least I don't see them. I don't know if other folks are seeing them, and it's just my experience.
No, I don't see them either.
So,
Oh my gosh, that's so weird. Hold on.
that's fine. That's fine. I wasn't sure initially.
No, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I was looking at I guess it was just me presenting to myself.
Ah, there we go.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
All right, let me just
Perfect.
start here. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, better?
Yeah, it's in presenter view. I'm not sure if you want to do it in slide view.
All right, let's try this one more time.
Totally okay.
All right.
Perfect.
All right, sorry. So this was the illustration that I used earlier to talk about the achievement gap versus the opportunity gap. And I want to, and this is one related to equity and equality. It's not much of an illustration. I will share the slides with Adam afterwards so that you will have access to the PowerPoint. I know that I've already sent a handout, but I will make sure that you have access to the slides. But this is the one that I was using when I was talking about equity versus equality. And again, saying everyone's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life thinking that it's stupid. And what are the implications of that? And so when we think about supporting students, like I said, we have to, standardize the process, but customize the implementation as we move throughout. So when I think about the school as a system, as educators, we have to explicitly acknowledge the behaviors that have really maintained this educational system that's predicated on middle class white norms, values, and beliefs, and challenge ourselves to think about things differently, challenge ourselves to think about what are our biases and how do they play out in different settings. So I want to give one example. Oftentimes what I hear when I go into schools and there's a large minoritized population, I hear that, parents don't value children's education because they don't participate in school activities, without really sometimes acknowledging or understanding what are the systems that are at play that inhibit parents' ability to engage in the ways that we think that they should be engaging in. Probably one of the ways to describe it is you think about hierarchy of needs, right? Most of us, when we wake up, we don't have to think excessively about how am I going to pay bills? How am I going to make sure that I have secured housing? For a lot of families, particularly those from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, they a lot of times are thinking about how do I make sure that we have the basic necessities for my family to be successful. So it doesn't mean that education is not important or less important, but we have to think about how do we distribute our time and resources and our priorities. If I went into a different school, middle class, upper middle class school, and I have parents that aren't participating, then even if I see them as, okay, parents or teachers or attorneys, and those parents don't show up, we often don't hear people saying, well, their parents don't care about school, that they're not involved. I mean, the same situation, like parents on both ends of the spectrum that struggle to make it to school on time and struggle to be responsive, but we have conceptualized them very differently because of their backgrounds. And so it's again important for us to think about what are the cultural and the contextual factors that are at play that have an impact on students' ability, willingness, capacity to engage with the school system. And how do we shift the way that parents are engaged with the school system? Because even for some of our parents who have had poor educational experiences, it's intimidating for them to be engaged in the education system themselves, which presents another challenge. And so, again, something that I think that we constantly have to be thinking about is related to equity. How am I thinking about my families and my students, and how are my biases coming into play when I see that they are involved or not involved, or engaging in other things that we tend to pass judgment around? Another example is stereotypes that minoritized students are underachievers or can't be good at math or science, or aren't college material. We've seen data and research that shows that for minoritized students, even in the case where they score, let's say, high on standardized tests, then we still see that they are less likely to be referred for advanced placement coursework, even when their scores are high. It's been written off as they got lucky or this was just a good day. And so when we look at classes, we see disproportionality and representation related to advanced coursework. Research has also shown that even school counselors, when students come in and talk about college or post high school opportunities, there often are differences in what options are presented to students based on biases, whether it's community college versus a 4-year university or a trade school versus a 4-year university. And to be clear, students should be able to choose either path that they want. But it goes back to opportunities. If they don't know that the opportunity is there, then they don't have an option to be able to select from it. So they might choose a community college or a trade school, perfectly fine. But some students don't even know that college is an option or a 4-year university is an option. And we've seen that differentially in terms of opportunities that are presented. Another thing that we have to be aware of. When I think about kind of where students are positioned in school, when I was young and I used to see the track, I used to ask my parents, like, why is it that they're staggered in that way? Like it looks like the person over here, far right, is at an advantage compared to the person at the far left. And it was explained to me, right, that because of the curve of the track, people are starting at different places so that they do have an equal chance at winning the race. So I look at that when I think about students, and let's say we're talking about white students and students of color, where we see there are these gaps in achievement that grow over time. And we see that white students have, historically performed better than students of color. And again, this is not to overgeneralize and say all of our white students, right? There are these confounding factors that come into play. White students from rural settings. I mean, that's one of the most underrepresented, under-researched groups in education. Because they are white, there's the assumption that they're okay. But we see that with white rural students, same kinds of things that we see with other students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, right? So this is just an example, but not an overgeneralization. But we see that this difference keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it's not only that there's this gap, but that the gap widens is even more concerning. We see the same things if I talk about students with disabilities versus students without disabilities. We see these gaps that continue to widen over time because of access to the curriculum, because of preconceived notions, because of differing expectations that we have for students. Mental health. When I think about students with mental health concerns and students without mental health concerns, again, we see the same kind of staggering. And so what we have illustrated in education is that there always seem to be these two dichotomous groups, one that is performing way ahead of the curve and one that continues to lag behind. And there are so many things that are at play that relate to that. And so another way to look at it is you think about the discrimination that different students have to experience when they're trying to kind of fight the good fight or stay in the race. And so discrimination is part of that. Poor schooling is part of that. Like I said, when we look at schools and we see differences in terms of access to resources, access to advanced coursework, access to early learning opportunities, there are differences based on school composition. This is another illustration of the track where we see some students getting what we call, I guess, a head start relative to other students. And so how are we constantly playing catch up, and what are the implications for that? School to prison pipeline, standardized tests. Standardized tests goes back to the illustration I showed earlier. But school to prison pipeline, we see that Black and Latinx students are 3 to 4 times more likely to be suspended from school. And even more shocking is over the past several years, we've seen that even in preschool students, Black students are more likely to be suspended. Though they make up about 19% of the preschool population, they represent about 35% of suspensions in preschool. I mean, the first question is, why are preschoolers being suspended at all? But the other question is, why are the rates so disproportionate? And so when we think about even your school-wide and your classroom matrices, we have to think about, are we creating expectations and norms that are relative to the cultural context in which they're being implemented? And so how do we engage students and parents in the process? When we define these subjective terms around defiance, disrespect, how do we define that? Because that can look different that could look different across context. And when we look at disproportionality, we often see that there are differences, not in referrals, not relative to referrals based on like fights, but relative to referrals based on these kind of more subjective categories around discipline, defiance, disrespect, these 3 Ds. And so it's important to consider our cultural context as we develop different norms for students. In doing so, we have to also think about breaking this deficit model. Historically, we have thought about deficits based or use that as an explanation for the underperformance of students of color and students from lower socioeconomic background, that then over time have led to disengagement, opposition, and on a large scale, educational disenfranchisement. And so how do we change that cycle where being different is not a deficit? Being different does not indeterminately link you to underachievement. Just because you're a Black student or a student in poverty does not mean that you should automatically be considered to be not successful or not able to be successful. But we've done that in subtle and overt ways in education. So let's focus on cultural deprivations. The disparities are not context specific. There is a national crisis in terms of education allotted to white students in comparison to that of Black and Latinx and even American Indian students. And that's really important to think about that. I know that we can think about our own school, which I think is exactly where we should be starting. And we say, in our school, these students perform like this. In our school, these students perform like this. But school after school after school that I'm in, that Adam's in, that Eric's in, that all of us are in, we see the same trends across states, across the country. And so there's this local crisis, but also this national crisis in terms of how students in schools are being supported. I mentioned Latinx and even American Indian students. American Indian students make up 1% of the public school population, but represent the most disparate outcomes relative to mental health problems, relative to academic achievement, relative to high school dropout. And so we have to really consider what students we're working with and what is the impact that our education system has had on them. So instead of thinking about how we have to fix the child, think about culture as a resource and how do we integrate the cultural values and communication styles and goals into teaching communication, the curriculum, and teaching communication in the curriculum. And so this is really important because sometimes you have students that it might be a 4th grader, a 5th grader, whom has to get themselves ready and go to school every day. That you have students who have to care for their younger siblings when they get home. That you have students that are largely acting independently because their parents are working or have other responsibilities. And so when they show up at school, then we sometimes have sympathy for these students and say, oh, well, I feel bad for them because they have to get themselves to school and things like that. being sympathy can be debilitating in a lot of ways, because what happens is if I feel badly for a child, then I'm less likely to have higher expectations. If I know that that student didn't do their homework or they're putting their head down, I'm more likely to kind of just let them be and say, well, I know that their parents aren't around, so they're not going to do homework, instead of finding opportunities for them to be able to still engage in that. And so it's really important for us to be thinking about how we perceive our students, because even if you have a fourth grader who gets himself up and gets stressed and shows up in school, guess what? They show up in school. And that's where the resiliency comes in. That's where the resource comes in. That there are so many situations that our kids and our students are in that we wish that we could fix, but we have to think about what are the things that we have control over. So even in the most difficult circumstances, when students show up at school, then how do we take advantage of that and recognize that, hey, they still are here, and what can we do here to help them to be successful? One of those things, and it'll come up when we talk about climate in a little bit, but one of those things is thinking about climate, school climate, and how students feel connected in school. We find that if students have one adult that they can connect to in school, that has a huge impact on their overall engagement in school, above and beyond sometimes race and ethnicity. That if there's one adult that they can talk to, they're more likely to persevere. It doesn't mean that they're going to be a straight A student, but it means that they know that there are people who are in their corner that are supporting them. Also, we have to kind of get off of this strict adherence to these antiquated structures around how families should be involved in schools, and where students feel like there's this totally different setting at home than at school, and that they have to be two different people. So how do we break down those barriers and allow for a more fluid process between students' home and school, so that both contexts represent the students and the teachers? People often say we have to meet students where they're at. And I challenge that by saying it's not necessarily that we're always meeting students where they're at, but we need to collectively be working towards the middle, right? Like there are some things that students value and some cultural norms that we could integrate into the school. And there are some things about the school that have to be in place that we can integrate with the students. And so it's not to say that, okay, if this is how they do everything at home, they have to do it exactly at the same at school. That's what meeting them where they're at is at. And that's what it means when we say meet them where they're at. Instead, like I said, it's really working towards the middle. And how do we come up with expectations together? How do we hold one another accountable? And how do we form relationships so that we can be accountable to one another? I want to try to show this video. Hopefully it plays. Adam, can you give me a thumbs up or down when I start to play it, just to let me know if you can hear it? Okay, 1 second.
Yeah, I saw the video. I wasn't able to hear it.
Okay, let me just take off my Bluetooth for a second.
I think we hear it.
This is how I see myself. I see myself as a person you can rely on. I see myself meeting someone that I can share my life with. I see myself singing, dancing, and laughing until I cannot breathe. And also crying sometimes. I see myself following my dreams, even if they are impossible, especially because they're impossible. I see myself as an ordinary person with an important, meaningful, beautiful life. This is how I see myself. How do you see?
And so I show this video because I think it's a good representation of, again, how students often see themselves, especially as they start school, and seeing themselves as capable, being excited about school, and being and thinking that they can be successful. But how we have so much control over that over time, and we can see how some students over time start to see themselves differently because of how they've been treated, because of expectations. So here again, this person with a disability sees themselves as capable and as being able to fully engage. But the way that we facilitate that, the way that we nurture that is really important, because we see that, students in first grade and second grade, they love school. In third grade, they start to be disinterested. In fourth grade, fifth grade, by the time they get to middle school, they've already checked out. And so again, we want to know, how do they see themselves, and how do we continue to cultivate that, and thinking about, again, this culture as a resource, instead of only as a deficit. So, in order to change the system, and here we talk about racism, but I'm talking about any of the isms, ableisms, whether it relates to aestheticism and gender and all of those, because it's so ingrained in the fabric of our institutions, it's easily to be self-perpetuating. I mean, really, all we have to do to maintain the current system is just do business as usual, without even changing anything, because it's so ingrained in what we do, that perpetuate these systems of unfair privilege and advantages. So it's like this moving sidewalk at the airport, right? You can kind of get on it and just sit there and not have to do anything, and you continue to move forward. In order to change things, though, we have to be willing to do something and to get off of the moving sidewalk, and not only get off, but to move at a pace that's faster than the systems that are perpetuating the status quo. And so, how do we, in our own ways, turn around and shift and do things differently, and do these incrementally, right? It's not to say that, okay, after this presentation, go make massive changes. If you start even with, how do I form relationships with my students, whether they're virtual or online? How do I just start there to get to know a little bit about them, and use that? Because when we think about cultural responsiveness, the cornerstone of that is relationship building. And so, how do we start to cultivate that within our own schools? I'm going to talk about culture. And for a second, Adam, can you send me a message about how much time is left? I'm going to talk about culture. So I've talked about this in different ways. When I talk about culture, it's a kind of long definition, but I spent like 6 years in grad school coming up with it. So indulge me for a second. But when I talk about culture, it's a set of values, beliefs, or behaviors that are shared by a group of people. Something that we hear all the time, right? That we understand that. When I talk about culture within the context of education, I'm thinking about how it's based on race, geography, students who were growing up in rural settings versus suburban settings versus city settings, right? A student who's growing up in New York City versus someone who's growing up in Brookline, or a student that's growing up somewhere in Connecticut, they have different experiences and have been exposed to different things. Socioeconomic status, experiences, or other unifying denominators. So that is based on disability. That is based on sexual orientation. That is based on family dynamics. And for a long time in education, when we talked about culture, we really only talked about race and ethnicity. And then we started to introduce socioeconomic status. But we have to think about all of these different variables also. Like I said, the video earlier illustrated a student with a disability. And so when I think about equality and equity and how do we support students, I'm talking about all students, and how do we do that in different ways. Also recognizing that we have these intersecting identities that sometimes are multiplicative in either positive or more negative ways, and we have to consider that also. The other thing about culture is it's always there, in these subtle or overt ways, and how we dress, how we talk, the music, our communication styles, our nonverbals. So it's always there, even though sometimes we can see it, and sometimes it's more subtle, and sometimes it's more salient. But it does have an impact on how they assign meaning to, interact with, and adapt to their environments. And I think that's really important for us to recognize, and also that it's ever evolving, and results from intra and interpersonal experiences. So this can change over time for students. Sometimes you see, I grew up as a military brat. So as a kid, I identified myself as a military brat. When people say, "Where are you from?" California, but I lived, the first 7 years in Germany and in Alabama. So like that still is, but always was a really big part of my identity because it helped to explain who I was or where I was from. As I've gotten older, I talk about it more, but not, I mean, I talk about it still, but not as much. You see this sometimes with, let's say, multiracial students who they might show up in sixth grade and they identify as being black, right? They show up in seventh grade and they identify as being white, and they kind of have these shifting identities as they try to figure out who they are. And it's up to us to allow students that space to be able to do so, because again, culture is ever evolving, and in different contexts, some of our cultural features, our factors, are more salient than others. If I'm in a predominantly white setting, then being a black woman isn't necessarily the first thing that I think about in that setting. If I'm in a setting that's predominantly white, then it's more apparent that I'm a black woman, and that becomes a stronger part of my identity because of the context that I'm in. In general, culture is so many different things. It's how we think, it's how we make a sense of information, how we acknowledge things, and it's expressed in so many different ways, through our behaviors, our values, the way we learn, and the way we teach. And so there's no one definition or one way to say like, how am I culturally responsive? It starts on different levels. I always think that it starts first with this self reflection piece, and then it goes to this kind of communication piece and how do you engage with other individuals, recognizing that self-reflection piece and the bias. And then the other piece is the curriculum piece or the instructional piece. One, how do you facilitate instruction? And two, what kind of instruction are you facilitating? Are you highlighting the voices of minoritized populations, of women in history, of different cultures, and how do you do that over time in ways that affirm the diversity that exists in our schools? I'm going to skip over a couple of slides. I talked about this earlier, so I'm not gonna go over it again. But this is just again, why is it important to be culturally responsive, and what are the reasons for that? And that's again just recognizing that there's so many differences and similarities that are at play that we need to acknowledge as we continue to work with students. I'll talk about one more thing, and then I'm going to move on to the school climate piece. But when I think about cultural responsiveness, indulge me for a second. I think about it in terms of like a pomegranate. But if you haven't had a pomegranate, think about it as an avocado or watermelon. But I think about pomegranates and I say to myself, like, oftentimes I bought pomegranates and I didn't get to them in time, and they kind of rotted essentially because I know that it's a lot of work to get to the middle of a pomegranate. I love pomegranate seeds, but it takes work. And so I think about that in terms of cultural responsiveness, that like I know that if I can get to this child, I know that if I can get to this student, that like once I have them hooked, then they're hooked, and then it's such a rewarding experience. But I also know that it's going to take work to get there. So I think about cutting through the initial part of the pomegranate, the outside, as that difficult process, because that it's that thick outer peeling and that you have to cut through. And so that's the first part where I'm cutting through it. And that sometimes, there's juice that is squirting, it's kind of messy. And I akin that to just one, taking that first step and saying like, I know that I have to do things differently, and I'm ready to engage in that process. But also, I'm saying again that you just take small steps. It's not to say that we wake up tomorrow and everything is different, but it's acknowledging I'm going to engage in that process. Thinking about self reflections. How do I think about different students, and what are the things that are at play? So I start to cut through that pomegranate because I'm engaging in that process. The next piece is, once you get it open, you have to get through the flesh and the seeds and kind of go through that. And this is that process of trying different strategies. Some will fail miserably. You will try to connect with some students and it won't work. You will use some terms or the wrong terminology or the wrong label, and it will be hurtful or offensive to someone. That will happen. I wish I could say that it doesn't happen, but it will happen. It still happens to me, but we have to be willing to start the process. And part of that means you want to have colleagues and administrators that support the process so that you don't have to feel like you're doing it yourself. But getting through that flesh is really that process of trying different things and learning about more resources and pulling those that work for you, because they have to be authentic. Sometimes we see culture responsiveness. We see these videos of people wrapping the Pythagorean theorem and doing all these different fancy things. You have to do what's authentic to you in terms of connecting with students. We don't have to put on circuses or pony shows. If you love that, that's great. But there are other ways. Some people relate based on sports or different activities. When you see somebody in your community and they know that you shop at the grocery store, they're like, "What? Like you buy food?" There are all these different ways that students kind of connect with you that we can engage in. Then finally, we get to the middle. And in the middle is where we really get this the fruits of our labor, so to speak. And we start to be able to engage with students and connect with students. And when I say that, I mean this process, sometimes it definitely is this iterative process that you have to go through over and over and over. Becomes a little bit more natural over time, but it's not about doing more work, it's about doing our work differently. It's not about doing, math, literacy, and then culture responsiveness. It's about how do we integrate those two, and how do we facilitate the learning process. Oftentimes we think about culture responsiveness as like, oh, I don't have time to do that. Again, it's we want to take certain things off your plate so that this is really about how do you do things differently, not in addition to. Being colorblind, we often say like, I see all my students the same. I don't see color. I grew up thinking that too. My mom would say like, you treat everybody the same. It doesn't matter. No matter who they are, you treat everybody the same. And I realized over time that being colorblind is not where we want to be. I think historically we've said that we're colorblind because we didn't want to talk about race. But really, when we say we're colorblind, it wrongly positions culture consciousness as being equivalent to racism. If I'm trying to describe a student, I have two Black students in my class, and they're saying, well, which student is struggling? And you're like, the one who's sitting in the far right corner who has on the blue jeans. And they're like, I don't know who. Like, if you're saying the Black student, then we can say the Black student who is struggling, right? But sometimes people think that if we do that, then we're automatically racist. And so it's important for us to be able to engage in conversations about race, socioeconomic status, all of these different variables, because if we don't talk about it, then we can't do anything to move forward. And we can have these open dialogues with our students. It's not ever too early to talk about race and to talk about these different isms. There are so many different developmentally appropriate resources that start from when kids are 3, 4, 5 years old and go throughout their education experience. So we have to change the norm in terms of thinking about that. The last thing that I'll talk about before I briefly go over the surveys is implicit bias. And again, that's something that we have to be aware of. And implicit bias is tough to adjust because it's just that it's implicit. One of the examples I can say is after 9/11, right? The media, the way that Muslims or people who wore hijab was portrayed was that they're all terrorists. And so I fly, pretty frequently. My parents were both in the military, and I remember 9/11, and my parents got deployed and all this stuff. And so both of my parents. And so I think about this sometimes because if I see someone for a long time, if I saw someone who was Muslim, especially in an airport or with a hijab, my default kind of fleeting thought is like, are they a terrorist? Are they associated with that? Because of what I've been inundated with in the media. I also know that, I mean, I've learned to have this kind of 1, 2 second kind of pause between my thoughts and my actions. So I can snap out of it and say, no, Tamika, that's ridiculous, right? I don't ask to change my seat. I don't cross over to the other part. But that if I fly tomorrow and I see someone, that still is a fleeting thought because it's the way that things have been normalized. When we look at doll studies and we ask 3 to 7 year olds in the 1960s, which doll do you prefer? White and Black students or Black kids, girls, chose the white doll because in the media we see white as being ideal, white as being what we want, white as being good. And they redid the study in 2010 and found the same results. And so again, implicit bias is not a representation of our actual behaviors because they're usually automatic, and we all have them and are all affected by them. And it's really important for us to acknowledge that we all have biases against people who look like us, against people who don't look like us, because of how we've been socialized. what we want to do is just be able to question that. Like I said, and then initial thought, if I see someone, if I see a student that walks into my room and I have this kind of like uh, different reaction to them, I just want to question myself and say like, where's that coming from? You know, like, why am I thinking like that, and processing it a little bit. Oftentimes we move throughout the day so quickly that we don't stop and pause and think about like, where's that feeling coming from, and how is that impacting how I engage with that student. I challenge, all of us to take the implicit association test that's offered through Harvard, because I think that it's a really good way to think about how we have these biases that we don't even know that we're aware of. I want to show one quick video, and then I'll sum up with some of the school climate data and how that connects to this.
All rise.
Concept of implicit bias and how it happens in ways that, oh, can you hear me? Yeah, and how it happens in ways that again we notice and we don't notice. And so I as you see this black male going throughout his daily life, there's so many subtle messages that are sent to him about who he is and this sort of the way that people perceive him, and that looks different for different people. I challenge you to look up Peggy McIntosh wrote an article, The Invisible Knapsack. And this article talks about essentially white privilege or these things that as a white person, some people don't have to ever think about. Have you ever been followed in a store? Have you ever been trying to rent or buy something and been able to do so without being discriminated against? All of these different sort of sometimes subtleties that as people of color we have to experience on a regular basis. And so I say that because I think it's another way to be self-reflective about who we are and how that has an impact on how we engage with our students and our families. And the important piece is, thank you Adam for putting that in there, the important piece here is to recognize that we all have certain privileges that are afforded to us, right? As a white individual, as a person with an advanced degree, as a person who's in a certain field, what we want to do is be able to think about how do we use our privilege in a way that is helpful to other people. It's not, to make people feel bad. We're talking about structural and institutional isms that are in place. This is not about one individual who had a bad experience with one student or one family or said the wrong thing. This is about changing structures. And so sometimes we have to depersonalize that, because I wouldn't say, oh, you're racist or you did this wrong, you did this wrong. This is, we have done things wrong. We need to change things, and we need to collectively be self-reflective about moving forward. And so that's just one of the resources that I think is helpful in starting to be self-reflective. I'll talk briefly about the climate survey, and then we'll just share one of the new resources that we've developed. There are 4 areas that we talk about or that we address in the climate surveys relative to teaching and learning. So how do students feel supported? Do they feel like there are high expectations? Relationships, peer and adult relationships, connectedness, parent involvement, institutional environment, the physical environment, the structure in the school. Do kids take care of the school? Do they see value in it? And then safety, order, and discipline. Are the rules fair? Peer victimization. The good thing, or I think the unique thing about, not unique, I think the good thing about these surveys is that we have students, oh, sorry, let me go back for a second. We have one for parents, students, and teachers. And there are a lot of different surveys out there. I'll say there's the California survey, there's the national survey, there's the one from the Department of Ed. I think that, I won't make a determination about which survey to use. Now, I did develop the Georgia climate survey, so I'm biased and will say, yes, of course, use that one. But I will say also that we don't really care what survey you use. What we have tried to do at the center is to, one, we validated the surveys so that because we strongly believe if you're going to hold people accountable to something, you want to make sure that the survey holds up. So I spent 6-7 years doing survey validation, factor analysis, all of this stuff to say, does it hold up and does it hold up across different populations? And so that's one of the resources you can use, also because it's free and it's available. PBIS apps or PBIS assessment without any cost, and you get to manipulate, you get to have immediate access to your data. You open it up, you close it, and you can look at the tables. I don't think that we should have to be paying for school climate surveys. There's an abundance of them. And I think that it's important for us when we collect this data to be able to get it back immediately, not have to wait 2, 3, 4 months to get it back, because it impedes our ability to move forward. And if we want to compare this alongside our discipline data, our attendance data, we can't do that if we're running at a 3-month behind, if we're running 3 months behind. If I see that Latinx males are suspended at higher rates than other students, how do I go back to the climate surveys and say, what are their perceptions of the school environment? Do they feel connected? Do they feel that the rules are fair? How do the teachers perceive different students? And so I look at this as a way to provide a more comprehensive narrative about the experiences that students are having. So we pair this with traditional data that you already have in your Swiss around discipline, around suspensions, even around attendance, and you pair this with that data to get a better picture of, this is what the data says, what are the students saying? What are the teachers saying? What are the parents saying? And how can we do things to create greater alignment across the different groups so that we can create a school where people feel successful? What we've also done is, I'll share this really quickly, because of everything that's gone on this year, we have made some modifications to the climate surveys. Jen Freeman and I worked on adding some contextual questions so that as you start to take the surveys, you can get information that helps to really put it into context. So for example, if I'm asking about student connectedness and engagement without acknowledging that because of COVID, there are a lot of people who are teaching or who are taking classes online and hybrid models, there are other people don't feel safe, then the data will be hard to interpret. And so what we have, one said, we usually say take the data, the survey at the beginning of the year. Right now, a lot of schools were pushing to take between now and December, even in January, and using this extensive survey. By extensive, I mean 36 items for the middle school survey, 11 for the elementary. And again, we have a number of questions that add some context around what is the experience, the learning experience of students, so that when you interpret that data, you can see students who are doing hybrid, or students who are in person, or students who have had to switch back and forth. What are their perceptions? So this is available through any PBIS, and I think it's posted on the website, right, Adam? The link. Yeah, so it's posted on the any PBIS website. I will also say, our traditional surveys are through PBIS assessments, and you can always access those for free. These are different in that we've added those contextual questions relative to COVID. And we moved it to this site so that instead of having to wait months and months, because obviously, there's everybody's backlog. Instead of having to wait to be able to get it uploaded through our PBIS assessments, we've created this other temporary portal so that you can collect data now, and we will still give it back to you immediately, and you still get to set it up. And so I encourage you to look at this as you think about collecting data around school climate, because we've had some schools try it already, and it's been successful. But again, mostly we want you to be able to put that data into context. So I think Eric showed earlier, there's a school climate administration manual that you can have access to, and you can, Adam maybe can put my email in the chat. You can always email me if you're looking for resources around the school climate data. We've created some data summary sheets. We've created a technical manual. We have sample parent approval or parent consent, passive consent forms, all of that, much of which is found in the in the school climate administration manual. But please feel free to contact me if you want any other information about how to facilitate the surveys, or questions about the surveys or the process, or sometimes people want to know, like, I have this data, what do I do with it? And feel free to contact me relative to that. Thank you for again, just engaging in this presentation today. And I hope that there's some nuggets in there that will help you kind of think about how to move forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Namika. That's wonderful. I think it's so helpful to help